Book discussion Wolf Hall by Hiralee Mantel. It's a book about the times of Henry VIII when he started divorcing wives and fighting the Catholic Church, and basically the beginning of the separation of the English Church from the Catholic Church in Rome. It is also the story of Thomas Cromwell, who is sort of the mastermind behind all of this. And therefore, it's a political, Shakespearean, historic, and also dramatic exhibit of times that I think are incredibly crucial for two reasons. Number one, it is the separation of the church for England and the creation of a sort of a new spiritual authority within England. I think this is the base for what became the Great English Empire, and I'm going to elaborate on that. And second, it's also an elaboration in general on, I would say, innovation, novelty, and the risks and opportunities that come with that. Just before I go, for new listeners, this podcast, the Not Even Wrong podcast, is the purpose is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund. We at Orange Capital Partners are first and foremost managers of money, investors in risk, wealth creators. And why do we discuss books in this podcast? Well, for two reasons. One is books are the sort of the conditioning of the mind, and like I say, it is not just a pastime for hedge fund managers, it is part of the business. So we cannot emphasize enough how important this is. And I think as a second reason why we do this is also to keep a record. It's good to go back and see how we thought about things, even if it's related to books, or how we interpreted certain books, how we interpreted certain stories. This is a very good example. Again, I mean, Wolf Hall is, you can say, well, it's just a historic essay on England. Well, why is this important for today? Well, it's incredibly important because, again, it shows the separation of England from the Catholic Church, which is a new spiritual mindset that is being implemented top down from the back then King Henry VIII. And that has huge repercussions. And I think it has huge repercussions on culture, it has huge repercussions on how people do things. And I think it was the base for what became England and the Great Empire. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's June 30th, 2022. This is Crim Telco. Since the last update, we're down 4.5%. The market's down 2%. For the year, we're down 47.5%. The market's down 20%. We're underperforming by 27.5%. So Wolf Hall by Hiralee Mantel, again, like I said in the prelude, it's mainly a book about Henry VIII, the King Henry VIII, and his separation from the church and the reasons why. And it's an inside look. It's kind of like a Netflix show on this, why? Because it's really well done. It's dramatic, it's detailed, but it's interesting. And I think Hillary did a very good job on that front. So for me, I want to discuss two main points that I took away from this book. Number one, it's the separation of the church. And this has huge repercussions. It is opening up a massive, massive sort of Pandora's box. Because if you give up the Catholic Church, if you give up the Pope and God as the central authority of what you do, well, you have to create a new authority. And in England, that was the Parliament. And the Parliament, of course, was always subject to the king's, caprices and all of that. But still, it is the beginning of the foundation of the constitutional monarchy. And the reason it starts is not because Henry wanted a constitutional monarchy, quite far from it. Henry wanted his way. He wanted an heir. He wanted, which is something I didn't know. I mean, he really wasn't a womanizer in the sense that he just wanted to have 8 wives or whatever. He wanted an heir. He wanted a son, and he couldn't get a son because the wives he married couldn't give him a son, so he kept divorcing them, kept killing them, and all of that stuff. But fundamentally, he was the foundation of the constitutional monarchy because he gave up on the church, because the church wouldn't sanction his divorces. So this is a perfect example of unintended consequences, where a despot, an egotistic maniac leader, if you want, creates the foundation for democracy. This is, in a nutshell, what happened during those times. This is my interpretation, and I'm sure people will have different interpretations, in particular Shakespeare, who was just following those times, maybe 50 years later. certainly had a different interpretation of that. It was all about blood and killing, and that's true. But like everything else, when you start something new, when you create a new spiritual basis in a society, you will have bloodshed. Same happened with the French Revolution, and the same happened with the Bolshevik Revolution. Of course, Bolsheviks certainly wasn't a good outcome. But I'm just saying, when you have new fundamental spiritual ideas about how society should be organized, you have bloodshed. And what happened in those times, this is sort of the first part of the 16th century, so 1520 to 1540, kind of that time frame. Henry VIII is married to Catherine of Aragon. That's the Queen of England. She is related to the throne in Spain. She is related to the throne in France. There is all kinds of alliances are made and all that kind of stuff. And Henry just chooses to separate from her because he wants a male heir. He chooses Anne Boleyn. She then gives him two daughters, as far I think, or one miscarriage, and she gets beheaded later on. This is not part of the book anymore. And then he keeps going. I think Henry VIII ended up having 8 wives, so, or at least a couple of wives and a couple of mistresses, lots of kids. And then what followed was also the big sort of controversy between Maria Stuart and Elizabeth, and the fight for the throne that subsequently and was enacted in England. But let's get back to Wolf Hall. So again, this fundamental necessity of Henry to separate from the church because he has new ideas about how he wants to organize his private life, and therefore separates from the Pope and has the necessity to create a new authority, and that becomes Parliament. Now, Thomas Cromwell, this is the second part of the story, which I think is very important. Thomas Cromwell is the mastermind, and whenever you have these types of situations where heads of state have new ideas about things, or CEOs have new ideas, I'm just thinking of Elon Musk and Glenn Shotwell and things like that. You always need, it's the Zuckerberg, Cheryl, whatever her name was. So you have this necessity to have what's maybe called a COO in the corporate world, or somebody who runs the show behind the scenes. And in this case, it was Thomas Cromwell. So I think those are the two main vectors in this book that really show that when you create this new spiritual foundation, in the case of England, really it was the constitutional monarchy. They didn't call it like that. They actually, but it was a necessity to have legitimacy. And the legitimacy was sought after in the nobles, in the aristocrats of England, because they were the powerful people. They had the money and they had the ability to raise armies, which is the two main important factors that count for even today. If you really think about it, power is about money and about the ability to execute violence on people. So those are the two main characters in the book, or in other words, the main vectors. And I find it very interesting that you have this. If you go back in history and you ask yourself, why was England so successful in terms of creating the great empire, but also in creating the Industrial Revolution and unleashing a wealth creation that is still going on until today? And the reason was because one guy, which was Henry VIII, broke with the status quo and started something new. It was messy, but he wanted it for his own personal reasons. He didn't have a grand plan. He just wanted it for his own personal reasons. And I think this is really interesting, let's say, also from a political economic perspective. When people have grand plans like Lenin, it goes wrong. But when people follow their own personal needs, like Henry, which is all just about, let's say, I want to get divorced and the Pope doesn't grant me the divorce, so I want to create my own sort of spiritual background. Well, then I'm going to go piecemeal. I'm going to create an innovation stack. I'm going to just build something that works so I can justify my own personal needs. And this is really what entrepreneurs do, scratch your own itch. Like, don't think too big in terms of, changing the world. Scratch your own itch. Now, having said that, of course, our biggest investment in Tesla is sort of the counter example, where there is a big master plan 1, 2, and now coming 3. So there is a big picture, but it's still scratching your own itch, which is, look, I just want to create an electric car. How do I do that? And then I go from there. I decarbonize the energy system of the world, and I do that by creating AI and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of little steps towards the grand plan, which is decarbonizing the earth. But let's get back to Wolf Hall. So I think, to summarize, I think what this book does, it explains in a very nice, subtle way how the world was in those days. So it has a very sort of novelistic, Dostoevskian almost feel. Details are being expressed in terms of how people are dressed, what people eat, how people think, how the light is in the morning in London and in the evening, and all those kinds of things. But it's not a novel in that sense. It is a historic novel. So it's not a novel. There's not a lot of drama in terms of love and sex and all that. But there is still drama. People get executed and all that kind of stuff. And you can see that one of the big things when you have these changes in the spiritual foundation of a society, people become pretty violent. So that's definitely one thing that is also happening. And I think that's where we are today. I've spoken about this in the past, how I feel that this whole cryptography and blockchain technology is sort of a new foundation of society where we have the authorization of society. So we're separating from another layer of authority. So it's very similar, actually. In that sense, we're very similar to the times of Wolf Hall in terms of separating from authority. We're questioning the parliament, we're questioning our president, we're questioning our jurisdiction, the Supreme Court, and we're trying to find a better solution, which is decentralized blockchain technology. So I think this book resonates really well with me today. I have a feeling we are in those times. That's why also we have this violence. Fortunately, the violence is mainly verbal on Twitter and things like that, at least for now. But it is very violent because, like in Wolf Hall, people have strong opinions, people have consciousness, people have all of these kinds of things. Thomas More, one of the big consciousness factors in the book, gets executed towards the end of the book because he doesn't give up on the authority of the church and the Pope and 1,000 years of history and all that kind of stuff. And that is the change. And I think the change that Henry VIII is bringing is in the end good, because it's the base of a better church, just simply better, in a sense, less corrupt. It is also the change in terms of the foundation for more checks and balances, that then is the foundation for the Industrial Revolution and the market-based economy that England executes towards the rest of the world. So those are the big themes in this book, and I find it very fascinating that you can go back in history, and if you really look very close, you see very interesting dynamics. And this is also David Deutsche, and theory is, observations are theory, Laden. You see, my observation of Wolf Hall is very different than somebody else's observation, and this is because I have a different foundation, different theory of the world. I see things there. I look at blockchain technology, which is a new spiritual foundation of society. I look at Wolf Hall and I look at Henry VIII. He wants a new spiritual foundation of society. So we're very similar. And this is also what Silvio Micali said. Nobody ever had the kind of power that blockchain technology could have, which is to define what is and what isn't. And that's exactly what Henry VIII is trying to do. He wants to define what is and what isn't. In this case, it's just a small, simple divorce, but it's a big deal for him because it's about heirs. It's about who's going to be the next king of England, who's going to, the bloodline. Is the Tudor bloodline going to survive? If he doesn't have a son, then, well, it's not, because then even if you have a queen, then some man is going to marry her, and then they're going to have kids and all that kind of stuff. So again, it is really interesting how your own foundation, the way you see the world, defines how you see, let's say, a book like this. And I think this is part of the reason why we cherish reading so much, because it is a feedback of your own brain. You see what you're thinking and how your brain is your experience, your knowledge is reacting towards a story, in this case Wolf Hall. And I think that helps you also reflect and understand how you think about the world and what you think are the most important things that are right now shaping the world. And therefore it is, like we said, conditioning of the mind. And Wolf Hall is a great example of that. Very highly recommended book for people that are interested in contemporary circumstances and also, of course, in history. Thank you.